A rescue swimmer went down the wire into 70 knots of wind. Below him, Bass Strait, the 27th of December, 1998, a yacht coming apart in the dark. 6 sailors died. 5 boats sank. 55 people were winched out in Australia's largest peacetime rescue from a race that had run safely for 53 years. This is the Tasman Sea, 2,000 kilometers wide, crossed daily by airliners, nicknamed the Ditch. The easy answer is the Roaring Forties. It's incomplete. The real question is why this water turns faster than crews can escape. And it has been doing that since 1642. Start with the shape of the place because the shape is where the trouble begins. The Tasman sits between the east coast of Australia and the west coast of New Zealand, closed at the north by the Coral Sea, open at the south to the Southern Ocean, and pinched at its southwestern corner by a gap between Tasmania and the Australian mainland that people have been dying in for 200 years. Roughly 2,000 kilometers across, something like 2,800 from top to bottom. The deepest part of it, the Tasman Basin, runs 4 to 5 kilometers down and touches nearly 6,000 meters at its lowest point. That is genuinely deep ocean. Nothing that happens down there matters to a crew on the surface. What matters is the edges. Because the Tasman is not one uniform body of water. It is a deep basin with a shallow lip, and the lip is where the traffic goes. Ships hug the coasts, yachts race down the New South Wales shoreline, fishing boats work the shelf, ferries cross the strait, and the shelf, in the southwest corner, is one of the shallowest, most exposed pieces of navigable water in the developed world. Bass Strait is about 250 kilometers wide and 500 long. Its average depth is around 60 meters. The deepest hole in it, in the Bass Basin, is about 86 meters. Large stretches sit between 30 and 80. To put that in something you can picture, if you stood the Sydney Harbour Bridge on the seabed in the middle of Bass Strait, the top of the arch would be well clear of the water. That is not a sea. That is a flooded plain with an ocean pushing into it. Now ask what that does to a wave. A wave in deep water is not really moving water. It is moving energy, and the water itself mostly rotates in place, in circles that get smaller the deeper you go. The circles reach down about half the distance between one crest and the next. That distance is the wavelength, and for ocean swell, it is enormous. A 12-second swell, meaning 12 seconds between crests passing a fixed point, has a wavelength of roughly 220 meters in open water. Its orbital motion reaches down about 110 meters. A 14-second swell, which the Southern Ocean produces without effort, reaches down more than 150. Bass Strait is 60 meters deep, so every serious swell that enters that strait is dragging its feet on the bottom. That is not a metaphor. The lower part of the wave slows against the seabed while the top keeps its speed. The wave shortens. The crests bunch closer together, and because the energy has to go somewhere, it goes up. The wave gets taller, steeper, and more vertical on its face until the front of it can no longer support itself and the crest throws forward and collapses. That collapse is the whole story. A tall wave that passes underneath a boat is a nuisance. A tall wave that breaks on top of one is a demolition tool. The difference between the two is not height. It is steepness. And steepness is set by depth and spacing, not by how impressive the number sounds on a weather chart. This is why wave height, the number everyone reaches for, is almost useless on its own out here. A 10-meter swell in deep water with 15 seconds between crests is a long, heaving, survivable ride. A 7-meter sea in 60 meters of water with 8 seconds between crests will break over a vessel, and then break over it again before the boat has finished rolling back from the first one. Recovery time is the number that kills people. Nobody puts it in a forecast. Hold that thought because it is going to come back with names attached to it. There is a second machine at work here, and it runs on warm water. Down the east coast of Australia, the East Australian Current pushes south. It is the western boundary current of the South Pacific Gyre, the southern hemisphere's version of the Gulf Stream, and it carries warm tropical water out of the Coral Sea and down along New South Wales. It strengthens as it goes, and between about 27 and 33 degrees south, its transport builds from roughly 25 to something near 35 million cubic meters of water per second. In the core, it can run it up to about 2 meters per second, just under 4 knots. 4 knots does not sound frightening. Stand on a beach and you cannot feel it. Put it under a hull and it changes the water itself. Around 31 to 33 degrees south, roughly off the mid-New South Wales coast, the current stops hugging the shore and separates. It does not stop. It breaks into enormous rotating eddies, hundreds of kilometers across, that wander south and southeast into the Tasman, carrying warm water with them. CSIRO and Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System have been measuring this system with moorings and satellites for years, and the picture is consistent. The Tasman is not a passive pool of cold southern water. It is fed, continuously, by a warm river coming down from the tropics, which then shatters into spinning pockets of heat that drift toward the places where boats actually sail. 2 things follow from that, and both of them are lethal. The first is mechanical. When wind blows against a current, the waves get worse. It is the same physics as the shallow water problem, arriving from a different direction. A current running against the direction the waves are traveling compresses them, shortens the distance between crests, steepens the faces, and in extreme cases stops the wave from progressing at all and forces the energy vertically. The East Australian Current runs south. A southerly gale on the New South Wales coast blows north. Put a serious southerly against that current, and you have manufactured, in open water, the same steep breaking sea that the shallow shelf produces in Bass Strait. Except now you have done it in water hundreds of meters deep, where nobody expects it. So here is the first thing that should bother you. The dangerous wave in the Tasman is not built by wind speed alone. It is built by direction. A 60-knot northerly on that coast is uncomfortable. A 45-knot southerly, in the same place against the same current, can be unsurvivable. Same ocean. Same day. Different arrow on the chart. The second consequence of all that warm water is worse, and it takes longer to explain, so I will hold it until the moment it kills somebody. Now bring the scale down. Forget the map. Put yourself on a deck. A boat in a steep breaking sea does not experience conditions. It experiences a series of individual impacts and the gaps between them. In a long, deep ocean swell, a crew has 15 seconds to recover between events, to get a hand back on a winch, to check that a hatch is dogged, to look at the compass, to breathe. In a short shelf sea, the interval collapses to 8 seconds, sometimes 6. The helmsman does not get to correct the course before the next face arrives. The person clipped to the jackstay does not get their feet back under them. Water that came aboard in the last wave is still on deck, still moving, still adding weight in the wrong place when the next one lands on top of it. That is what "the sea got up" actually means. It means the pauses disappeared. And the pauses disappearing is the mechanism that runs through every single story in this documentary. From a Dutch navigator in 1642 to a bulk carrier lying on a New South Wales beach in 2007. The Tasman does not usually kill people by being violent for a long time. It kills them by removing recovery intervals faster than human beings, and their equipment can adapt. Which raises the obvious question, and it is the one that organizes everything that follows. If we know all this, if the depth is charted, the current is measured, the storms are forecast, the radios work, and the rescue helicopters are fueled and standing by, why does this sea keep taking people who did everything the system asked of them? The people who lived on these coasts before any of that existed had an answer. It was not a better forecast. It was a better relationship with the question. The Maori name for the Tasman Sea is Te Tai o Rehua, not a blank space on a chart. A named body of water with known moods, sitting on the western side of a country whose entire population had arrived by sea, and who understood from experience exactly what that western coast did. Polynesian voyaging into New Zealand was one of the most demanding navigational achievements in human history. Open ocean passages of thousands of kilometers made deliberately, with return capability using star paths, swell patterns, cloud formations over unseen land, bird behavior, and watercolor. It is worth being precise about what that knowledge actually was, because it is routinely patronized as folklore. It was not folklore. It was an observation system. A navigator reading swell was doing something a modern instrument still cannot do easily, distinguishing multiple overlapping wave trains by feel, identifying which one came from a distant storm and which one was being generated locally by the wind in front of them, and inferring from the mismatch that weather was coming from a direction the sky had not yet revealed. That is a forecast. It is generated from the deck, in real time, with no equipment. The same competence existed along the Australian side. Aboriginal communities on the New South Wales coast had detailed working knowledge of a specific and violent local phenomenon that Europeans would later name the southerly buster. It is a sharp southerly change that runs up the coast, and the Bureau of Meteorology defines it with hard numbers. The southerly wind has to exceed 29 knots, and the temperature has to fall at least 5 degrees within 3 hours to qualify. In practice, the temperature can drop 10 to 15 degrees in under an hour, and gusts commonly reach 90 to 100 kilometers per hour. The Great Dividing Range, running close and parallel to the coast, helps squeeze and accelerate the change as it moves north, which is why it arrives with such abruptness. European settlers wrote about it from the earliest decades of the colony, and the observation network has been logging it since the 19th century. But the people who had been fishing that coast for thousands of years were not surprised by it. They read it in the sky and in the water, and they went in. It is the part that always gets lost. The advanced technology was not the canoe. It was the decision not to launch. Because here is what the whole of the rest of this story is about. Every group that came to the Tasman after that arrived with a schedule, a cargo to deliver, a contract to meet, a mail service to win, a race to finish, a crossing to complete before a sponsor lost interest, a coal berth booked. And a schedule is a promise made to people on land about water they cannot see. The Tasman does not negotiate with schedules. It removes options. And the first European who tried to impose one on it lost 4 men in a single afternoon and never set foot on the country he had found. In December 1642, Abel Jansen Tasman was working for the Dutch East India Company with a commercial objective, not a romantic one. He had 2 ships, the Heemskerk and the Zeehan, and orders to find out whether there was a great southern continent worth trading with. He had already sighted the west coast of what he named Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. And then he had done something that nobody in Europe had done before. He had crossed the Tasman Sea. He did not know that is what it was. He simply sailed east and found land. What he found was the west coast of New Zealand's South Island. And the west coast of New Zealand is not a place that invites a stranger ashore. It is a wall. Mountains coming almost straight down into deep water, very few sheltered anchorages, and a swell arriving from the Southern Ocean with nothing to slow it. Tasman coasted north, looking for somewhere to stop, and eventually found what looked like an opening, a wide bay at the top of the South Island on the 18th of December, 1642. He anchored. Boats came out from the shore, waka, Maori canoes, approached the ships, and there was an exchange of sound, horns and trumpets from both sides, which each party appears to have interpreted through its own conventions. The following morning, a small boat was moving between the two Dutch ships, carrying men across the gap. A waka came at it and struck it. 4 of Tasman's men were killed. The Dutch fired, and at least one Maori was hit. Tasman weighed anchor and left. He named the place Murderers Bay. Today it is Golden Bay in the Tasman district of New Zealand. And he sailed north without ever putting a foot on the land he had just added to the map of the world. Look at what that encounter actually was, stripped of the mythology that has grown around it. A crew with a schedule, in a foreign sea at anchor in an exposed bay, decided that the safe move was to keep the boats running between the ships. It was a routine piece of shipboard business. That single ordinary decision in that particular place cost 4 lives, and Tasman's response, to leave immediately, was the correct one, because he had no way to recover the situation and nowhere else to go. He had discovered a coastline he could not use. The company got a chart with a line on it and a warning attached. New Zealand's west coast offered almost nothing to a European ship, no reliable harbor, no safe approach in a westerly, and an ocean behind you that took weeks to cross. For 127 years, no other European vessel came back. James Cook did not arrive until 1769, and when he did, he approached from the east. So the sea got a name from a man it turned back, which is the first fact that should reset your expectations about this place. The Tasman was not conquered and then occasionally dangerous. It was a barrier first. Everything after that is people finding reasons to cross a barrier. They found plenty. By the end of the 18th century, there was a colony at Sydney, and Sydney needed things: seals, whales, timber, flax, grain from Van Diemen's Land. And the fastest way to move any of it involved a question nobody could answer. Was Van Diemen's Land attached to the mainland, or was there water between them? If there was water, the saving was enormous. A ship coming from Britain or India to Sydney had to sail around the bottom of Tasmania and back up, adding roughly a week to the voyage. A strait would let ships run straight through. In 1798 and 1799, George Bass and Matthew Flinders sailed the sloop Norfolk around Van Diemen's Land and proved the strait existed. Flinders named it after Bass. The colonial administration understood immediately what it meant, and traffic began using it almost at once. Here is the reversal, and it is a big one. The shortcut was real. It genuinely saved about a week, and it took ships out of deep water and drove them into the shallowest, most confusing, least charted stretch of water in the region. A 60-meter shelf, studded with islands and reefs, with strong tidal streams, frequent thick weather, and no lighthouses at all for the first several decades. The result is written across the seabed. Bass Strait and the islands in it became one of the most concentrated shipwreck zones in Australian history. King Island, sitting right in the western entrance where ships came in from the Southern Ocean, collected wrecks at a rate that eventually forced the colonial governments to act. The worst of them happened on the night of the 4th of August, 1845. The bark Cataraqui, 815 tons, had left Liverpool in April carrying emigrants to Melbourne. 367 of them, many women and children in family groups, plus 44 crew. It was a long, grinding, ordinary voyage. One crewman had been lost overboard on the way. 6 people had died. 5 babies had been born. 409 people were aboard when the ship came up on the approaches to Bass Strait in heavy weather, at night, with the captain uncertain of his exact position. The Cataraqui struck rocks on the southwestern coast of King Island. Within an hour, the vessel had gone over onto her port side. The crew tried cutting away the masts to right her. It did not work. And then the specific geography of that coast took over. The ship was close to land, close enough to see it. But the reefs and the surf between the wreck and the shore made the last few hundred meters impassable. The ship broke up through the night and into the following day. 9 people out of 409 survived. The chief mate, 7 seamen, and 1 passenger. The National Museum of Australia records it as the country's worst civil disaster, and the mechanism was not a monster wave or an exotic storm. It was a shallow shelf on the windward side of an island, in bad visibility, on a route people used because it saved a week. Understand what that combination has just demonstrated, because it is the template for everything that follows. The Tasman's southwestern corner does not kill people by being remote. It kills them by being close to land. Deep water is survivable. The shelf is not. And the reason ships are on the shelf in the first place is always the same reason. It is faster, and somebody is waiting. The colonial response was infrastructure. Lighthouses went up on the Strait's key hazards through the middle of the 19th century, including on King Island itself. Charts improved. Wreck numbers fell. And that is a genuine success? It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The lights did what lights do. They told a navigator where he was. They could not tell him what the sea was going to do next. That is the gap that the next 150 years of technology kept trying to close, and kept only partly closing, and it is worth being precise about the sequence, because each solution created its own exposure. Sail gave way to steam. A steamship did not have to wait for a fair wind, which meant it could keep a timetable, which meant that for the first time the Tasman had scheduled crossings. Timetables are a promise. A sailing master who did not like the look of the sky could sit in shelter for 3 days, and nobody thought less of him. A steamer master doing the same thing was answering to an agent, a mail contract, and a passenger list. Steel replaced wood. Engines got more reliable. Hulls got stronger. Every one of those changes did exactly what it was supposed to do. And every one of them also raised the level of weather a captain could reasonably be expected to sail into. The improvement did not just make crossing safer. It moved the line at which a captain was allowed to say no. Then came the wireless, and with it the single most misunderstood safety development in maritime history. Radio meant a ship in trouble could be heard. That is not nothing. It is the difference between a vessel disappearing and a vessel being searched for. But listen to what radio actually changed and what it did not. It changed the information available on land. It did not change the distance from the ship to the nearest help, the speed of the help, or the sea state the help had to cross to get there. Nowhere on Earth demonstrated that gap more brutally than the middle of the Tasman Sea, and the demonstration came from the air. On the evening of the 10th of September 1928, a 3-engine Fokker monoplane called the Southern Cross took off from Richmond, near Sydney, and pointed itself at New Zealand. 4 men were aboard: Charles Kingsford Smith, his co-pilot Charles Ulm, the navigator Harry Litchfield, and a New Zealand wireless operator named Tom McWilliams. They had planned to leave on the 2nd of September and had been held on the ground for 8 days by weather. They covered 2,670 kilometers in 14 hours and 25 minutes and landed at Christchurch on the 11th. First aircraft ever to cross the Tasman. What happened in between is the part that matters. They flew into an electrical storm. Ice and rain built up on the windshield until the pilots could not see forward. Ice came off the propellers and damaged them. The radio transmitter went out for several hours, which meant that for a large portion of the crossing, the only people on Earth who knew whether the Southern Cross still existed were the 4 men inside it. Nobody could have helped them. There was no aircraft in the region capable of finding them over open water at night. No vessel positioned to search, and no method of getting anything to a floating wreck 1,000 kilometers from anywhere in time to matter. They knew that when they took off. Everyone in aviation knew it. This is the condition the middle of the Tasman imposes, and it has never fully gone away. 2,000 kilometers of water means that at the midpoint, you are 1,000 kilometers from either shore. Rescue, in that situation, is not a service you call. It is an outcome you might get days later, if you are still afloat, if your position is known within a few tens of kilometers, and if something with enough range happens to be available. 7 years later, the same aircraft went back out over the same water and turned that abstraction into hours of manual labor. The 15th of May, 1935, King George V's Silver Jubilee. Australia and New Zealand were about to be connected by a commercial airmail service, and the contract for it was worth having. Kingsford Smith took the Southern Cross up from Sydney carrying a Jubilee airmail load, around 30,000 letters in 21 mail bags, with P.G. Taylor beside him and John Stanage on the radio. This was not a stunt flight. It was a demonstration, in front of two governments, that the Tasman could be flown to a timetable. They were hundreds of kilometers out over the sea when part of the exhaust manifold on the starboard engine broke away. Follow the chain, because this is a very clean example of how one small mechanical event removes options in sequence. The broken piece of exhaust went into the starboard propeller and shattered it. A shattered propeller on a running engine is not simply a loss of thrust. It is a vibration problem severe enough to tear an engine off its mounts, so the starboard engine had to be shut down immediately. That left a 3-engined aircraft flying on 2, over the middle of the Tasman, with a heavy load. 2 engines could hold the aircraft up, they could not hold it up indefinitely at that weight. So the crew started throwing things out. Cargo went. Most of the mailbags went. The entire commercial point of the flight tipped into the sea because the aircraft needed to be lighter than the contract needed to be honored. That is the moment the objective changed. They were no longer flying a mail service. They were flying an aeroplane that had to reach land. Then, the second complication arrived, and it was worse than the first. The port engine, now doing far more work than it was designed to do on a long overwater leg, began losing oil and overheating. If it failed, the aircraft came down in the Tasman Sea, and the crew's chances after that were close to zero. There was oil available. It was in the dead starboard engine, on the other side of the aircraft, outside, in flight. P.G. Taylor climbed out of the cabin onto the wing struts of an aeroplane in the air over open ocean, drained oil from the useless starboard engine into the metal case of a thermos flask, climbed back, crossed the aircraft, went out the other side, and poured it into the port engine. Then he did it again. He did it 6 times, with Stanage helping him at the opening, in the noise and the slipstream and the cold, while Kingsford Smith held the aircraft as steady as an overloaded twin would hold. They turned back. They reached Sydney. Everyone lived. For that, Taylor received the Empire Gallantry Medal, which was later exchanged for the George Cross. The shattered propeller went into a museum collection where it still is, along with photographs of the Southern Cross on the ground afterwards, with the wreckage of the blade still attached, and a mechanic named Tommy Pethibridge removing it. Now here is the reversal, and it is not the one people usually take from that story. The radio worked. Stanage was in contact. Australia and New Zealand knew, in something close to real time, that the Southern Cross had lost an engine over the middle of the Tasman and was in trouble. It made no difference to their survival at all. Not one thing that saved that crew came from outside the aircraft. Everything that saved them was inside it. A man's hands, a thermos case, a decision to dump the payload, and an engine that held together long enough. The radio did exactly one useful thing. It meant that if they had gone into the water, the search would have started in roughly the right part of the ocean instead of nowhere at all. That is the specific illusion the Tasman keeps exposing. Communication and rescue are not the same capability. They improve on completely different curves. Communication improved by orders of magnitude across the 20th century. From spark gap wireless to satellite beacons that fix a position to within a few dozen meters. The speed at which a physical asset can cross open ocean to reach a person in the water has barely changed at all. A helicopter is faster than a steamship, but a helicopter has a range, and the middle of the Tasman is outside it. Regular commercial flying boat services across the Tasman began in 1940, and after the Second World War, the crossing became routine, then invisible. Today, it is one of the busiest international air corridors in the Southern Hemisphere. Several million people a year fly over that water in a little over 3 hours, and almost none of them look down. The sea underneath them did not change, and the assumption that it had, that engines and forecasts and radio had reduced the Tasman to a commute, is exactly the assumption that, on a Wednesday morning in April 1968, killed 51 people inside a harbor, not out in the open ocean, inside, within sight of houses, in a capital city, with tugs, pilots, police, and a full emergency response standing on the shore watching it happen. To understand what happened at Wellington on the 10th of April 1968, you have to go back to the warm water. Tropical cyclones form over hot ocean. That is their fuel. They need sea surface temperatures somewhere around 26 or 27 degrees and up, because what powers them is evaporation. Warm water going into the air as vapor, then condensing higher up and releasing heat, which drives the whole engine. Move a tropical cyclone south into cold water, and it should die. It loses its fuel supply. The warm core collapses, and the system winds down. This is the textbook version, and it is why people assume the Tasman is a graveyard for cyclones, rather than a workshop. What actually happens is more complicated, and considerably more dangerous. When a decaying tropical system moves into the mid-latitudes, it does not simply switch off. It can undergo what meteorologists call extratropical transition. The storm stops running on ocean heat and starts running on temperature contrast instead. The difference between the warm tropical air it dragged south with it and the cold air coming up from the Southern Ocean. During that transition, two things frequently happen at once. The system's wind field spreads out over a much larger area, and if it meets a suitable front, it can deepen again. So a cyclone that has technically stopped being a cyclone can cover more ocean and hit harder than it did in the tropics. The Tasman is an unusually good place for this to happen, because the East Australian current keeps pushing warm water south along the western side of the sea, and the Southern Ocean keeps pushing cold air north across the bottom of it. Warm water going one way, cold air coming the other, and a decaying tropical system arriving in the middle. In April 1968, the system was called Giselle. It came down from the tropics, tracking south across the Tasman toward New Zealand, and it met a separate storm arriving from the south, out of the Antarctic air mass. The two merged over Wellington. Wellington sits at the bottom of New Zealand's North Island, at the northern end of Cook Strait, which is the gap between the two main islands. That gap is a wine machine. Air flowing across New Zealand hits a mountain chain running most of the length of the country and gets funneled through the one big break in it, accelerating as it goes. And the same effect you get putting your thumb over a hose. Wellington is famous for wind for a structural reason, not a poetic one. On the 10th of April, gusts of 275 kilometers per hour were recorded in Cook Strait. That is a gust in the range you would associate with a severe tropical cyclone, arriving in a temperate capital city, at the entrance to a commercial harbor. The inter-island ferry Wahin was arriving from Lyttelton with about 730 people aboard, roughly 610 passengers and 123 crew. It was an overnight run that thousands of New Zealanders made every year. A car ferry, a cabin, breakfast, and Wellington in the morning. At about 10 to 6 that morning, with winds gusting between 130 and 150 kilometers an hour, Captain Hector Robertson made the decision to take his ship into the harbor. Think carefully about that decision before judging it, because it is the hinge of the entire event. The alternative to entering the harbor was staying outside it, holding position in Cook Strait, in the open, in what would turn out to be the worst wind ever recorded there. in a large ferry with a high superstructure and shallow draft. That is not obviously safer. The harbor entrance is narrow, but inside it is sheltered. Ships had been making that approach in bad weather for decades. He had a pilot's local knowledge, radar, and an engine room. He went in. 20 minutes later, the wind had increased to 160 kilometers an hour, and the ship lost its radar. That single failure is the one that decides everything after it. Losing radar in that entrance, in that visibility, with that wind, meant the bridge no longer knew precisely where the ship was in relation to Barrett Reef, a rock formation sitting in the middle of the approach that every Wellington mariner knows about, and nobody can see in a gale. The Waheen's steering failed as well. At around 25 to 7, not certain of his position, the captain ordered full astern. At 20 to 7, the Waheen went backwards onto Barrett Reef. The starboard propeller was knocked off. The port engine stopped shortly after. A large modern ferry, with several hundred passengers aboard, was now sitting on a reef inside a harbor entrance, with no propulsion, no steering, and no radar, in a 160-kilometer-an-hour wind. Robertson ordered all watertight doors closed, and both anchors dropped. Passengers were told the ship had gone aground. The anchors dragged. The wind and sea pushed the Waheen off the reef and up into the harbor, past Point Dorset, and she went with it. Nearly 9,000 gross tons of ship being blown across a bay with people aboard and nothing to stop her. The tug Tepuhi came out from Queen's Wharf and got alongside at about 11 in the morning. By 10 to 12, she had a line on the ferry. They tried to tow. The line parted. This is where the situation stops being recoverable, and it is worth sitting with, because it is a shape you will see again. A rescue asset arrived. It was competent. It was crewed by professionals. It reached the casualty, and the physical conditions destroyed the connection between them. Nobody made a mistake. The sea simply exceeded the breaking strain of the equipment available. All through this, and this is the part the court of inquiry would fix on afterwards, water was getting into the vehicle deck. A car ferry is structurally a very large open box. The vehicle deck runs almost the full length of the ship with no internal bulkheads to speak of, because you need to drive cars from one end to the other. Get water onto that deck, and it does not stay put. It runs to whichever side is low. That extra weight pulls the ship further over, which lets more water in, which pulls it further over. Engineers call it the free surface effect. It is the reason ro-ro ferries have a specific and ugly failure mode. They can look stable and then go over very fast with almost no warning. The Waheen had been damaged, was without power, and had been taking water for hours. Just before 1:30 in the afternoon, Captain Robertson gave the order to abandon ship. She was about 200 meters off Seatown Beach. 200 meters. You can see individual houses at that distance. People on the shore could see the passengers. And here the geography did something almost unbelievably cruel. The tide had turned. The outgoing tidal stream through Wellington Harbor's narrow entrance runs hard, and it caught the lifeboats, the rafts, and the people in the water, and it carried most of them away from the beach 200 meters to leeward and across to the other side of the harbor, to the rocky, exposed, largely inaccessible shore below Eastbourne. That is where most of the people who died that day died. Not on the reef, not in the capsize. In the water and on the rocks of a shoreline that had no road access to speak of, in cold water, in a gale, after hours of exposure, several kilometers from where anyone was waiting for them. Residents of Eastbourne came down to the shore and pulled people out by hand. Cars were driven as far along the coast as the road went. People carried survivors up the rocks and into houses and warmed them in their own bathrooms. That improvised, unglamorous civilian effort saved lives that no official capability could have reached in time. At about 2:30, the Waheen capsized off Steeple Rock. 51 people died that day. Another passenger died later of injuries. a 53rd death in 1990, was also attributed to the disaster. The Court of Inquiry's central finding on the sinking itself was mechanical and blunt. The buildup of water in the vehicle hold was the reason the ferry finally capsized. On the timing of the evacuation, it reached a conclusion that is worth quoting the substance of carefully because it cuts against the instinct everyone has when they hear the story. The inquiry concluded that more lives would almost certainly have been lost if the order to abandon ship had been given either earlier or later than it was. Sit with that. The single decision that everybody wants to criticize. Why did he wait until 1:30? For was, according to the inquiry, close to the only survivable option available. Earlier, and people would have gone into the water in worse conditions with the ship still moving. Later, and they would have gone in as she rolled. That is the Tasman system doing what it does. It does not usually present a good option and a bad one. It presents a narrowing set of bad options, and then it removes them one at a time. The radar, the steering, the propeller, the anchors, the tow line, the beach, until what is left is a choice between two kinds of loss. And notice where all of this happened. Not in the middle of the sea, inside a harbor, in a capital city, in daylight, with the shore in sight, with tugs and police and ambulances and a whole country's emergency capability within a few kilometers. Sheltered water is not shelter. The Tasman exports its weather, and the coast is where people and hard objects are. And for all the horror of that day, the Wahine had one advantage that almost nothing else in this story does. Everybody knew where she was. A capital city on the beach, tugs in the harbor, police, ambulances, a whole country listening on the radio. The rescue problem at Wellington was physical, not informational, from the moment she struck the reef until the moment she rolled over. 5 years later, at the other end of the same sea, the opposite happened, and it exposed a hole in the system so large that fixing it changed Australian maritime law. The Blythe Star was a small coastal freighter, 44 meters, 321 tons, a 650 horsepower diesel, 9.5 knots flat out. She was a working ship doing an unglamorous job, coastal cargo around Tasmania. At 6:30 on the evening of the 12th of October 1973, she left Prince of Wales Bay in Hobart, bound for King Island in Bass Strait, with a cargo of fertilizer and beer. Around 350 nautical miles. A routine 2-day run. Her master, George Cruikshank, chose to go around the west coast of Tasmania rather than the east. That choice saved about 4.5 hours. You have seen this exact decision before in this story. It is the same decision that put ships into Bass Strait instead of around the bottom of Tasmania in the 1800s. Take the shorter route, accept the more exposed water, save the time. It is not reckless. On most days, it is simply correct, and it had been correct for that ship on many previous voyages. 14 hours out, near Southwest Cape, the bottom left corner of Tasmania, where the Southern Ocean arrives without interruption, the ship developed a starboard list. One of the crew, Mick Dolman, described what followed in plain terms. The ship took a list to starboard, and then it took a further list, which he called a death roll. She capsized and sank with almost no warning. 10 men got out, all of them, into an inflatable life raft with a canopy, stocked with tinned water, biscuits, flares, oars, and a bailer. In the circumstances, that is close to a miracle of seamanship, and it should have been the end of the emergency. No distress signal was sent. The master was not on the bridge when it happened, and the emergency radio went down with the ship. Hole number 1. Here is the second, and it is worse. No sailing plan had been filed with any authority. Nobody ashore knew whether the Blythe Star had gone up the east coast of Tasmania or the west. There was no requirement to report a position during the voyage, so there was nothing to check against. so the ship simply did not exist, as far as the outside world was concerned, until she failed to arrive. The alert was not raised until 2 days after she sank. What happened next became, at the time, the largest maritime search ever conducted in Australia. Aircraft and vessels covered enormous areas of ocean. They found nothing. Not a trace of the ship, not a piece of wreckage, not the raft. They were looking on the wrong side of Tasmania for part of it, because nobody could tell them which route she had taken. The 10 men in the raft were doing the only thing available to them, which was drifting. They drifted for 9 days. The raft was carried roughly 400 kilometers, around the bottom of Tasmania and up the other side. They had no engine, no sail, no meaningful ability to steer, and a canopy that kept some of the weather out. They rationed the tinned water and the biscuits. They bailed. They were continuously wet and continuously cold, and every day the search was looking somewhere they were not. On the 4th day, the second engineer, John Sloan, died. He was suffering from hypothermia and had been without his thyroid medication since the ship went down. The men buried him at sea from the raft. On the 21st of October, the raft came ashore at Deep Glen Bay, on the southeast coast of Tasmania, roughly 75 kilometers from Hobart. Getting to land did not end it. It is the detail that makes this incident different from every other one in this documentary. Deep Glen Bay is a small cove surrounded by cliffs of about 200 meters. The 9 men still alive, starved, hypothermic, salt-burned, weak after 9 days without proper food, were now on a beach they could not climb out of, in a part of Tasmania with no road access and nobody living there. They cut up the raft to make clothing. John Eagles, the chief engineer, died on the 22nd of October after they reached shore. Ken Jones, the first officer, died on the morning of the 23rd. The official search had already been called off. The authorities had concluded that everyone aboard the Blythe Star was dead. On the 23rd of October, 3 men, Mick Dolman, Malcolm McCarroll, and the ship's cook, Alf Simpson, got themselves out of the cove by bushwhacking through the scrub until they reached a logging track. A truck driver found them. His first reaction, reported afterwards, was disbelief. "You're dead." Dolman's answer was, "No, we're not." The full rescue was completed the following day, 12 days after the ship went down. 7 of the 10 men who escaped the sinking survived. 3 did not. Now the part that matters more than the story. The inquiry into the loss of the Blythe Star produced a set of reforms that changed how Australian shipping operates. The Navigation Act was amended so that ships of 300 tons and above had to file sailing plans and transmit daily position reports. A national ship reporting system was established so that authorities would know where vessels were and would notice quickly when one stopped reporting. Lifeboats were required to carry radio beacons. The technology that became the EPIRB, the Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, which is now mandatory even for small private vessels going more than a couple of nautical miles offshore. Every one of those requirements exists because 10 men spent 9 days in a raft while a country searched the wrong ocean for them. And this is where the whole chain of this documentary locks together, because those reforms are a large part of the reason the story of 1998 has 55 survivors in it. When the Sydney to Hobart fleet was being destroyed in Bass Strait 25 years later, the rescue system knew where boats were, could identify who was calling, and could work from beacon positions rather than guesses. That capability was not free, and it was not inevitable. It was written into law after a small freighter carrying fertilizer and beer went down off Southwest Cape, and nobody could say which way she had gone. There is a postscript, and it took 50 years. On the 12th of April 2023, the CSIRO research vessel investigator, working on a 38-day voyage studying a submarine landslide off the west coast of Tasmania, located the Blythe Star. She lies about 10.5 kilometers west of Southwest Cape, in 150 meters of water, intact, and sitting upright on the seafloor with her bow pointing northwest. She had been sitting there, undisturbed, the entire time. A few kilometers off a coastline that thousands of people have sailed past since. That is worth holding on to, because it says something about this sea that no statistic does. The Tasman and its approaches are not a distant wilderness. They are a working ocean, close to shore, with cities on it. Things disappear in it anyway, 20 kilometers from land, and stay disappeared for half a century. And in December 1998, into the shallowest, most exposed corner of it, 115 yachts sailed out of Sydney Harbor on a summer afternoon with a forecast that said it was going to blow. The Sydney to Hobart is 628 nautical miles. It starts on Boxing Day, in Sydney Harbor, in front of an enormous spectator fleet, and it has done so since 1945. The course runs out through the Heads, turns south, follows the New South Wales coast down, crosses Bass Strait, runs down the east coast of Tasmania, rounds Tasman Island, cuts across Storm Bay, and finishes up the River Derwent in Hobart. Read that course description again with everything you now know. It goes down the coast, where the East Australian Current runs south, and the southerly busters run north. Then it crosses the 60-meter shelf. Then it finishes in a bay called Storm Bay. This race is not incidentally exposed to the Tasman's mechanisms. It is routed straight through all of them, one after another, in the order that does the most damage. And it has to start on the 26th of December. That is not negotiable. It is fixed by tradition, by television, by the summer holiday calendar, by the spectator fleet, by the international crews who have flown in, and by the simple structural fact that a race with a movable start date is not a race. Every other decision in this story flows from that one immovable point. In 1998, there were 115 starters. The fleet was enormously varied, which matters more than people realize. At the front were maxi yachts with professional crews, including Sayonara, owned by Larry Ellison, with one of the strongest afterguards afloat. Behind them, spread over the next several hundred kilometers of ocean by the end of the second day, were mid-sized racer cruisers, family boats, club boats, and crews of weekend sailors who had qualified, prepared, provisioned, and were doing the thing they had looked forward to all year. That spread is the first thing that shapes the disaster. A yacht race is not a convoy. 12 hours after the start, the fleet is a line stretched across hundreds of kilometers of ocean, and every boat in it experiences a different weather event at a different time, with a different amount of warning. Now the weather. The Bureau of Meteorology's forecasts going into the race indicated strong southerly winds, in the order of 25 to 35 knots, increasing to gale force. For an offshore fleet of that quality, that is a hard race. It is not an emergency. Southerly gales in Bass Strait around Christmas are an ordinary feature of the event. Crews expected to be beating into a southerly at some point. They had prepared for it. The boats were built for it. What developed instead has its own name in the meteorological literature. The Australian Boxing Day storm of 1998 was the subject of a peer-reviewed synoptic study published in the journal Weather and Forecasting in 2000. The explosive development of the low began on the 26th of December, the day the fleet left Sydney, and it reached peak intensity on the 27th, with mean wind speeds reported in the 50 to 60 knot range. The word explosive is technical, not dramatic. A low is classed as explosively deepening. Meteorologists say a bomb, when its central pressure falls at least 24 hectopascals in 24 hours. In the fastest phases, these systems can drop 10 hectopascals or more in 6 hours. That is the whole problem compressed into a single number, not the strength of the storm, its rate of change. Because here is what a rate of change does to a fleet. If a system takes 2 days to build, A skipper can watch the barometer, evaluate, and act. And every option on the chart is still available while he does it. If it builds in 6 hours, the evaluation and the escape have to happen inside the same 6 hours, in deteriorating conditions, while the crew is already tired and already sailing hard. The ingredients were all sitting there. Warm ocean off the New South Wales coast, courtesy of the East Australian Current and its eddies, supplying heat and moisture to the developing system. The same relationship the Bureau describes for East Coast lows, where sea surface temperature gradients associated with warm eddies of that current help the lows develop. Cold air pushing up from the south. A pressure gradient tightening across Bass Strait. And under all of it, a 60-meter seabed. By the 27th, the leading boats had already crossed the strait. The bulk of the fleet had not. What the middle of that fleet sailed into that afternoon was the exact combination this entire story has been building toward, arriving all at once. Wind against current. The southerly came up hard against the south-setting water off the New South Wales coast and the eastern approaches, compressing the wave spacing. Wind against shelf. As the seas ran into Bass Strait, they hit 60 meters of water and stood up. Wind against duration. The system had come up so fast that the sea state was still building violently rather than settling into any kind of pattern, which produces the worst possible surface. Not regular waves, but a confused, cross-running sea with occasional walls in it. Crews reported waves in the 15 to 20 meter range and above. Some accounts put individual seas higher than that. Those numbers are contested and always will be, and it is worth being honest about why. Wave height reported from the deck of a small yacht in a gale at night is an estimate made by a person being thrown around inside the phenomenon they are trying to measure. And human estimates in those conditions consistently run high. Later analysis and hindcasting produced lower figures for significant wave height. Both things can be true. The average sea was smaller than the crews said, and individual waves in a confused shelf sea can be very much bigger than the average. And the argument about the number misses the point anyway. What destroyed boats that day was not height. It was faces, steep, breaking, and close together. Understand what a breaking wave does to a racing yacht physically, because it is not what people imagine. It is not a slow capsize. A yacht in that sea is hit on the side by the moving crest of a wave that is collapsing. The boat is not gently rolled. It is thrown sideways and rotated, sometimes through 180 degrees, in a second or two. Rigging goes into the water. Anyone on deck is either clipped on and dragged under with the boat, or not clipped on and gone. Inside, everything not bolted down, sails, tools, batteries, food, floorboards, people, is thrown across the cabin and then thrown back. Masts break, windows blow in, rudders fail. Then the boat comes back up, and the crew has somewhere between 6 and 10 seconds before the next one. There is hard research behind this, and it did not come from the Tasman. It came out of the 1979 Fastnet race in the Irish Sea, which killed 15 sailors and prompted the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers, together with American yacht racing bodies, to put models in tanks and hit them with breaking waves to find out what actually causes a capsize. The results are unsettling in their simplicity. What matters is the height of the breaking part of the wave relative to the length of the boat. A breaking crest of around 30% of hull length was enough to roll some designs. At around 60%, capsize became close to unavoidable, regardless of how well the boat was designed or sailed. Do the arithmetic for a 40-foot yacht. 12 meters of hull. A breaking crest of about 4 meters puts you in the zone where some boats go over. A breaking crest of 7 meters puts you in the zone where the boat's qualities stop mattering. 7 meters of breaking water in a shelf sea with a 50-knot wind on it is not an exotic event. It is Tuesday. By the afternoon of the 27th, boats up and down that stretch of water were being rolled. And this is the moment to be precise about the option that disappeared. Because everyone's first instinct, why didn't they just turn around and run for shelter? Deserves a real answer. The nearest usable refuge for the boats in the worst of it was Eden, on the far south coast of New South Wales. Many boats did retire and go there. 71 yachts withdrew from that race. But getting to Eden, from where the fleet was, meant turning across the sea. A yacht heading into breaking seas takes them on the bow, which is the shape the boat is designed to present. A yacht turning to run takes them on the side during the turn, beam on to a breaking crest. And beam on to a breaking crest is precisely the attitude in which yachts get rolled. So the escape route required performing, deliberately, the maneuver most likely to kill you, in the conditions where it was most likely to kill you. That is what a disappearing option actually looks like. It is not a door slamming. It is a door that stays open, while the corridor to it fills with the thing you are running from. Some crews made that turn and got away with it. Some made it and were rolled during it. Some decided the safer course was to keep the bow into it and take whatever came, and were rolled anyway. There is one more piece of context that people leave out of this story, and it changes the moral shape of it completely. The boats that suffered worst were not, in general, the ones that were badly prepared or badly sailed. Race yachts in that fleet had qualifying passages behind them and safety gear aboard. The crews were, by any normal standard, competent. Larry Ellison, whose Maxi won line honors in that race, described it afterwards in terms that made clear he had no interest in ever doing it again, and Sayonara was one of the most capable boats in the ocean that night, with one of the best crews. If the strongest boat with the best crew was in survival mode, the failure was not distributed by skill. It was distributed by position. Where you happen to be, in a fleet strung out across hundreds of kilometers, when the low went off. Which is another way of saying that the thing that decided who lived and who died that night was mostly geography and timing. The first mayday came in on the afternoon of the 27th. A mayday from a yacht in Bass Strait does not go to a rescue helicopter. It goes into a system, and the system has stages, and each stage costs time. The call is heard by a coast radio station, by the race's radio relay vessel, by another yacht close enough to pick up a weak signal and pass it on. The information goes to the National Search and Rescue Authority, which in Australia sits in Canberra and coordinates civil maritime search and rescue across an area of ocean roughly a tenth of the Earth's surface. Coordinators build a picture: who is calling, where they are, how good that position is, what state they are in, what assets exist within range, how much fuel those assets have, what the weather is doing at the casualty and along the route to it, and which of the available machines can actually operate in it. Then someone has to decide and authorize and brief and launch. Then the aircraft has to fly there, into the same weather. On the 27th of December, 1998, that system did something it had never had to do before. It ran that entire sequence, repeatedly in parallel, for dozens of separate casualties spread across hundreds of kilometers of Bass Strait, in conditions that were at or beyond the operational limits of the aircraft involved. Before it was over, 35 military and civilian aircraft and 27 Royal Australian Navy vessels were committed. Start with what those aircrews were being asked to do, because "a helicopter rescued them" is a sentence that hides an appalling amount. A rescue helicopter over a yacht in a 50 to 60 knot mean wind is not hovering in any normal sense. The pilot is flying the aircraft continuously against a moving air mass, over a vessel that is itself moving vertically through many meters and rotating, with a mast, if it still has one, swinging through the airspace the aircraft needs to occupy. The winch operator is looking down through a door at a target that disappears underwater and reappears. The person on the end of the wire is lowered into breaking seas, and the wire is the only thing connecting them to the aircraft. and it can foul on rigging, on wreckage, on the yacht itself. Standard practice in those conditions is often not to winch onto the boat at all. It is to put the swimmer in the water clear of the yacht, have the sailors jump, and pick them out of the sea one at a time. That means every person being rescued has to voluntarily leave the only solid object in their world and swim into a breaking sea toward a man on a wire. They did it dozens of times that day and night. The first major casualties came in during the afternoon. VC Offshore Stand Aside was rolled, lost her mast, and was holed. The crew were still aboard a hull that was filling. A rescue helicopter from the South Care Service reached her. Over that operation, and a second one, the South Care crews took 9 sailors off 2 different stricken yachts, Stand Aside and Midnight Special. Midnight Special was rolled, dismasted, and later sank. Look at the pattern in those two, because it repeats all night. The boat is not lost in a single catastrophic instant. It is disabled. Mast gone, hull damaged, steering compromised, and then it becomes a slowly failing platform in a sea that is still running. And the crew's problem shifts from sailing to staying alive on a hulk until an aircraft can find them. Every hour that takes, the platform gets worse. Late that afternoon, the yacht Sword of Orion was rolled through a full rotation. Glenn Charles was at the helm. He was 33, a British sailor of real quality who had represented Britain in the Star class at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. When the boat went over, he went into the sea. He had been clipped on. The tether did not hold. That detail matters more than any wave height in this entire story, and it is worth stopping on. The single most fundamental safety practice in offshore sailing is that you clip your harness to the boat. It is drilled into every crew member. It works until the load exceeds what the equipment was built to take, and the load generated by a body being hit by a breaking crest while the boat rotates away underneath it is enormous. The crew of Sword of Orion could see him in the water. They had no mast, no engine they could use, and no way to maneuver a disabled yacht upwind through breaking seas to reach a man a short distance away. One crewman attempted to go after him and was stopped. There is a difference between a rescue and a second casualty, and in those conditions, the difference is about 90 seconds. Glenn Charles was lost. His body was never recovered. The remaining crew of Sword of Orion were taken off later. That is one of the hardest facts in this whole documentary. Not that nobody tried. That trying was, physically, not available. The boat that could have picked him up in any normal circumstance had been converted, in about 2 seconds, into a floating object with no propulsion. Not far away, the yacht Kingura was knocked down past 120 degrees, and an American crewman named John Campbell went over the side. He was in the water for around 40 minutes. 40 minutes is a long time. Bass Strait in late December is not Arctic, but immersion in moving water strips heat out of a body fast, and 40 minutes of it in a breaking sea, being lifted and dropped, swallowing water, watching a boat you can no longer reach, is enough to produce serious hypothermia. He had it when they got him out. A police helicopter found him and lifted him from the sea, and that recovery, one man in open water, 22 miles south of Gabo Island in that state, required an aircraft to locate a human head among breaking crests. He survived. That is a piece of good news in a story that is short of it, and it exists because a helicopter happened to be close enough and because he stayed on the surface long enough. Now, the overnight period, which is where this event turns from a bad race into a disaster. Darkness removes the last thing the rescuers had going for them. A winch operator can work in the dark with lights, but a search cannot. Finding a small yacht or a life raft or a person in a running sea at night is close to impossible unless you have a precise position and something on the target that emits a signal. Aircraft that had been shuttling casualties all afternoon were now fuel limited, crew duty limited, and searching by instrument and luck. The business post Naiad was rolled during that period. Twice. She was dismasted, her crew battered, and the boat was left wallowing. 2 men aboard her died. Bruce Guy suffered a heart attack. Philip Skeggs drowned. Both deaths were recorded as occurring on the 27th of December. Consider what that combination proves. One man was killed by the sea directly. The other was killed by what the sea does to a human body's physiology. By hours of extreme physical work, cold, fear, and violent motion, in a body that had been running at its limit since the previous day, in a situation with no possibility of rest. The Tasman does not need to sink your boat to kill you. It only needs to keep you working past your limit for long enough. The survivors of Business Post Naiad had to remain aboard a disabled yacht with 2 dead crewmates until they could be lifted off. That took hours. And through all of it, up and down that stretch of Bass Strait, the same physical process was repeating in different boats. Roll, dismass, flood, mayday, wait. Loki, knocked down past 120 degrees with a cabin window broken in. B-52, rolled and dismasted with structural damage. Solo Globe Challenger, rolled to 135 degrees and dismasted. Team Jaguar Infinity, dismasted with structural damage. Mi Intinta, holed and sunk. 71 boats retired from the race. 5 sank. 44 finished. Sayonara took line honors in 2 days, 19 hours, and 3 minutes. The handicap winner, the overall winner of the race, the trophy that actually matters in offshore sailing, was AFR Midnight Rambler, a 35-foot boat sailed by Ed Saltis and Bob Thomas, which had done what almost nothing else in that fleet managed, kept sailing through the worst of it and got to Hobart. That result is not a footnote. A small boat, well handled, came through a storm that broke much larger and more expensive vessels. Size did not determine survival. Handling, luck, and position did. But there was still one boat unaccounted for, and the search for her would run for another 2 days. The Winston Churchill was a wooden yacht built in 1942, and she was one of the boats that sailed in the very first Sydney to Hobart in 1945. She was not a modern lightweight racing machine. She was heavy, deep, beautifully maintained, and had a reputation as a sea boat. The kind of vessel that a lot of experienced sailors would rather be in than a stripped-out carbon racer when it starts blowing. That reputation was earned, and it was not wrong. A heavy displacement hull with a deep keel does not get flicked around by a sea the way a light boat does. It goes through waves, rather than over them. In a long ocean swell, it is a genuinely more comfortable and more forgiving platform, which is precisely the point that the 27th of December 1998 made in the worst possible way. 9 people were aboard, with Richard winning as owner and skipper. They were doing what everybody else in that fleet was doing, getting hammered, sailing conservatively, waiting it out. Then the hull failed. An old wooden boat is a structure of planks fastened to frames, and the whole assembly is designed to work, to flex slightly, continuously, in a seaway. It handles that beautifully for decades. What it is not designed for is a series of impacts in which the boat is picked up by a steep face, unsupported for a moment, and dropped onto solid water. In a shallow, short, breaking shelf sea that happens over and over, and each impact loads a wooden hull in a way no long ocean swell ever does. She sprung. Water came in faster than it could be dealt with. At that point, every option closes at once. You cannot fix a failed hull at sea in a gale. You cannot pump faster than a structural leak. You cannot sail somewhere in a boat that is filling. There is exactly one action available. Get a distress call out with your position and get off the boat before it goes under you. They did both. A mayday went out. The crew got into 2 life rafts, and here is where this incident teaches something none of the others in this documentary has taught yet, something that applies to every distress signal ever transmitted from open water. A position report tells the world where the vessel was. It does not tell them where the people are. The moment 9 people left that hull and got into 2 inflatable rafts, they stopped being a boat at a coordinate and became small, drifting objects on a moving surface, pushed by a 50 to 60 knot wind and a sea running with it, in an area where the current is also going somewhere. Life rafts drift fast. They sit high, they present a lot of surface to the wind, and they have no ability to hold position. Within hours, the 2 rafts were separated from each other, and both were well away from the position the Winston Churchill had reported. Search planners deal with this by calculating a drift model, wind, current, leeway, elapsed time, and expanding a search area outward from the last known position. The area grows as roughly the square of the time. Every hour of delay does not add a strip of ocean to search. It adds a ring. At its height, the search operation covered 4,000 square nautical miles, with dozens of military and civilian aircraft involved. To picture that, an area of open water larger than a good-sized country being scanned for 2 orange objects a couple of meters across in a breaking sea where every wave crest is white and every trough hides whatever is in it, by crews looking through windows for hours on end. Out on the water, the rafts were doing what rafts do in that sea. Richard Winning, describing what happened after his group became separated, said plainly that the raft capsized twice. Read that as a physical event rather than a phrase. An inflatable life raft in a breaking sea is turned over by the crest, and the people inside it, already soaked, already cold, holding on in the dark, end up underneath it, in the water, inside an enclosed space full of air and gear and each other, and have to get themselves out and get it back over and get back in. Then it happens again. The second raft fared worse. 3 men were washed out of it. John Dean, James Lawler, and Michael Bannister died. The bodies of Lawler and Bannister were recovered on the Tuesday, around 50 miles offshore. John Dean was never found. 6 of the 9 survived. 4 were taken from one raft, and 2 more were lifted from the other. The people in the second raft were in the water, and in that raft for well over a day before anyone reached them. Stop and look at what that means in terms of the chain of rescue, because it is the clearest illustration in this entire story of the gap between being heard and being helped. Their distress call worked. It was received. The National Rescue System knew a yacht had sunk and roughly where. The largest peacetime rescue operation in Australian history was already running at full capacity in that exact stretch of ocean, with dozens of aircraft airborne. There was no failure of will, no failure of communication, no failure of organization, and it still took more than a day, because the physical problem, find 2 small drifting objects in 4,000 square nautical miles of breaking sea at night, with aircraft that have to keep going home to refuel, is not a problem that determination solves. This is the reversal the incident delivers, and it is the one that should stay with you. Communications technology answers the question, does anyone know we are in trouble? It does not answer, can anyone get here? Those are separate systems with separate limits, and the Tasman is very good at exposing the space between them. By the 29th, the search was being wound down. 6 people were dead in total across the fleet. 4 bodies had been recovered, and 2 men, Glenn Charles and John Dean, were never found. There is an aspect of this that deserves saying plainly, because it gets lost in the arguments about wave heights and race management. The people who went into that storm were not fools, and they were not tourists. They were experienced offshore sailors doing a race with a 53-year history in boats they knew, having received a forecast that described a hard but recognizable set of conditions. The professional crews on the biggest boats in the fleet were in survival mode alongside the club sailors. The rescue crews who went out to them flew into exactly the same weather that was destroying the yachts, in aircraft with their own hard limits, and kept going back. And the sea did what a 60-meter shelf under an explosively deepening low does, which is remove recovery time until things that had worked for decades stopped working. A harness tether, a wooden hull, a life raft canopy, a tow line, a forecast. The question after an event like that is always the same. Whose fault was it? Australia spent the next 2 years answering it in a coroner's court, and the answer that came out was more uncomfortable than a simple verdict because it implicated the system rather than the people inside it. The New South Wales State Coroner, John Abernethy, released his findings on the 12th of December 2000, almost 2 years after the race. They were not gentle. On the organizers, the coroner found that the Cruising Yacht Club of Australia had abdicated its responsibility to manage the race and put it in language that left nothing to interpret. The race management team, he found, played the role of observers rather than managers. The race director resigned the day after the findings came out. On the weather service, the coroner found that there had been insufficient effort to inform race officials that the forecast had dramatically worsened, and as a remedy, he required that the Bureau add maximum wind, gust speed, and wave height to its forecasts. 14 formal recommendations came out of the inquest. The Cruising Yacht Club had already run its own race review and published the findings in May 1999. And in the same year, it established a trust dedicated to supporting search and rescue organizations around Australia. Over the following years, the requirements changed substantially. Every sailor now carries a personal emergency beacon, generally fitted to the life jacket, along with a harness line to clip to the boat and a personal torch. And the Bureau of Meteorology delivers detailed compulsory briefings to the fleet before the start. Many of those changes were adopted by other races internationally. Those are real improvements. Anyone who has been in the water at night knows exactly what a personal beacon and a light are worth. Now look at what the recommendations actually addressed and what they could not. Almost every one of them improves information or improves the odds of being found. Better forecasts, better briefings, better beacons, better lights, better record-keeping about who is where, which is the correct response to what went wrong at the organizational level, and it has certainly saved lives since. But run the 1998 storm again with all of it in place, and ask what changes. The fleet still has to start on Boxing Day. It is still strung out across hundreds of kilometers by the second day. The low still deepens explosively over Bass Strait on the 27th. The seabed is still 60 meters down. The southerly still runs against the current, and a boat in the middle of that fleet, holding a forecast that now correctly states a maximum gust of 80 knots and a maximum wave height of 15 meters, is still 8 hours from the nearest shelter, and getting there still requires turning beam on to breaking seas. Better information. Same options. That is the reversal that this whole event turns on, and it is not a criticism of forecasting. Forecasting in 1998 was already good enough to identify a dangerous system. It has improved enormously since. The problem is structural. A forecast is a warning, and a warning is only useful in proportion to the number of things you can still do when you receive it. The Tasman specializes in destroying that proportion. When a system deepens at 10 hectopascals in 6 hours over a fleet that needs 8 hours to reach shelter, the arithmetic has already decided the outcome before anyone reads the bulletin. You can improve the warning indefinitely and not gain a single minute of escape time. There is a second limitation, and it goes back to the physics. The numbers the coroner mandated, maximum gust and maximum wave height, are the two most intuitive numbers in marine weather. They are also not the ones that break boats. What breaks boats is steepness and spacing, how vertical the face is, and how many seconds you get between impacts. A forecast that says 15 meters tells you almost nothing about whether those 15-meter waves are long Southern Ocean swells you will ride over or short shelf seas that will land on you. The number that mattered most on the 27th of December 1998 was the interval between crests, and it is still not the headline figure anybody quotes. That is not a scandal. It is a genuinely hard forecasting problem, and modeling of sea state in shallow, current-affected water has improved a great deal since. It is simply worth knowing that the metric everybody argues about is not the metric that does the damage. There is one more piece of the aftermath worth stating carefully, because it is still argued about today. The coroner's findings about race management and about the communication of the forecast were, and remain, contested by people who were involved. Sailors who were out there have disagreed publicly for over 25 years about what was known, when, by whom, and what any of them could reasonably have done differently. That disagreement is not evasion. It reflects a real difficulty. The event happened to 115 separate boats in 115 separate places, and no single account of it is complete. What is not in dispute is the sequence. A recognized gale forecast, a system that intensified faster than the fleet could respond to, a shallow sea that turned wind into breaking walls. 6 deaths, 5 sinkings, 55 people lifted out of the water by crews who flew into the same storm. And the race went again the following December. And it has gone almost every December since. The only cancellation in its history came in 2020. And that was a pandemic, not a storm. That is not stupidity. It is the last and most important element of the system this documentary is actually about. The reasons people enter the Tasman do not go away after a disaster. The race exists because it is hard. Ports exist because trade exists. Fishing grounds exist where the water is productive. And the water is productive partly because of the same currents and upwellings that generate the weather. Aircraft cross because 2 countries have to be connected. Every motive that puts a person on that water is still there the day after the funerals. Which brings us to the part of the Tasman that the entire rescue apparatus of 2 wealthy countries still cannot reach. Everything you have heard so far happened close to land. Golden Bay is a coastal anchorage. King Island is in the strait. Wellington is a harbor. Bass Strait is a shelf between 2 Australian states, and the 1998 fleet, for all the horror of it, was inside helicopter range of the New South Wales and Victorian coasts. That is why 55 people came home. Aircraft could get there. The middle of the Tasman is 1,000 kilometers from either shore. Put a person in the water there, and the entire modern rescue system reduces to a very short list. A long-range aircraft that can find you and drop equipment but cannot land. And a ship that might be a day or 2 away and might not exist at all. That is the situation Kingsford Smith and Taylor were in when they were transferring oil in a thermos case. And in the one respect that matters, how long it takes to physically reach someone. It has not fundamentally changed since 1935. In January 2007, a man deliberately paddled into it. Before that, it is worth knowing exactly what would have come for him. Because the modern rescue system is genuinely impressive, and its limits are geometric. Australia's Rescue Coordination Centre is responsible for a search and rescue region of about 52.8 million square kilometers. That is roughly a tenth of the surface of the planet, covering parts of the Indian, Pacific, and Southern Oceans, and running down to the Australian Antarctic Territory. New Zealand's Rescue Coordination Centre handles a region of about 30 million square kilometers, stretching from the mid-Tasman Sea east to roughly halfway to Chile, and from close to the equator down to the South Pole. Read the boundary again. From the mid-Tasman. The 2 national systems meet in the middle of this sea. If you get into trouble on one side of an invisible line out there, one country coordinates your rescue. On the other side, the other one does. Both centers are professional, both are well run, and both cooperate closely and routinely. The line is administrative, not physical, and it makes no difference at all to how long it takes something to reach you. The alerting side of the system is close to miraculous by the standards of any earlier era. A modern distress beacon transmits on 400 sash Chester Thor's 6 MHz to a constellation of satellites, and the alert, along with a position, reaches a rescue coordination center within minutes. If the beacon is registered, and registration is free, the center also knows whose it is, what vessel or aircraft it belongs to, and who to phone to confirm whether it is real. So the first two problems that killed people for the whole of maritime history are essentially solved. Somebody knows you are in trouble. Somebody knows where you are. Now the third problem, which nobody has solved. A rescue helicopter is the only asset that can pick a person out of open water. Helicopters have a radius of action, and over water, with a hover and a recovery and a return leg and legally required fuel reserves, that radius is a few hundred kilometers from a base, not a few thousand. Long-range fixed-wing aircraft can reach far out into the Tasman and can search effectively, and they can drop equipment, life rafts, radios, supplies. They cannot land on the sea, and they cannot lift anybody, which leaves ships. Any merchant vessel in the area can be tasked to divert, and merchant crews do this willingly and often. A container ship making 18 knots covers about 33 kilometers in an hour. If the nearest suitable vessel is 500 kilometers away, that is 15 hours before it arrives, in whatever weather caused the emergency. And then it has the separate and extremely difficult problem of recovering a person from the water alongside a hull the height of a building. Set that against the other clock. In water at 15 degrees, a person in a life jacket without an immersion suit is looking at survival measured in hours, not days, and long before death, cold takes away the ability to grip, to swim, to hold on to a strop, to help. Rescue does not become impossible when the person dies. It becomes impossible sometime earlier, when they can no longer participate in it. So the modern reality of the middle of the Tasman is this. Your beacon will be heard within minutes. Your position will be known to within a few dozen meters. An aircraft may be overhead within hours, and it will be able to see you and talk to you and drop things to you, and it will not be able to take you out of the water. The thing that can take you out of the water is either a long way away or does not exist. Andrew Macaulay understood that better than almost anyone, because he had built his entire crossing around it. He was an Australian mountaineer and sea kayaker with a serious record, not a novelty adventurer. What he intended to do was paddle a kayak from Tasmania to New Zealand, roughly 1,600 kilometers of open Tasman, solo and unsupported. Nobody had done it. The equipment tells you how clearly he had thought about the problem. His kayak, built by Paul Hewitson of Mirage Sea Kayaks, was 6.4 meters long, 62 centimeters wide, and weighed 60 kilograms empty. Onto it, Macaulay designed and built himself a fiberglass canopy, a pod, which he called Casper, mounted on pivot arms so that it could sit behind him on the deck while he paddled during the day, and be swung forward and locked down over the cockpit at night. That canopy was the single most important piece of equipment on the boat, and its purpose was specific. A sea kayak in open ocean will capsize. That is not a possibility. It is a certainty over a month at sea, and it will happen at night while you are asleep. The canopy was there so that when the boat rolled with him inside it, he would still be inside it when it came back up, sealed in, attached to the vessel, alive. He had made an earlier attempt in December 2006 and turned back. That is worth noting because it establishes that this was a man capable of aborting. On the 11th of January 2007, he left Fortescue Bay in Tasmania. He expected to reach Milford Sound, on the west coast of New Zealand's South Island, on the 8th of February. 29 days at sea in a kayak is a physiological event as much as a nautical one. He paddled, ate freeze-dried food, collected and treated water, and slept in fragments, sealed under the canopy, while the boat did whatever the sea told it to. He was continuously wet, continuously cold, and continuously working. Salt water strips skin. Sleep in a sealed pod on a moving sea is not rest. And the entire time, he was in the one part of the sea where the rescue system reduces to a radio call and a very long wait. He very nearly got across. People forget that. He was almost there. On the 9th of February 2007, 29 days out, a distress call came through on VHF radio to the Maritime Operations Centre of Maritime New Zealand. The reception was poor, and the transmission was broken. What could be made out included the phrases, "My kayak is sinking," and "I need a rescue," and a reference to being about 30 hours from Milford Sound. His actual position was 67 nautical miles off Milford Sound, about 124 kilometers. Understand the shape of what happens next, because it is the cruelest version of the pattern this documentary has been tracing since 1935. The call was received. It was received by a professional rescue coordination center in a country with a well-developed search and rescue capability from a position roughly 120 kilometers offshore. Not the middle of the ocean, not 1,000 kilometers out, but close enough to the coast that on a calm day, an aircraft could be overhead in under an hour. A search was launched. The next day, a New Zealand Air Force aircraft found the kayak. It was semi-submerged. The canopy, the essential piece of equipment, the thing designed to keep him attached to the boat through a capsize, was missing. Andrew McCauley was not there. His body has never been recovered. The coroner found that he died from drowning on or about the 9th of February 2007, after becoming accidentally separated from his capsized kayak. He was not tethered to the boat at the time, and the finding is that he was most likely swept away from it. Look at the mechanics of that ending, because there is a specific engineering lesson inside it that generalizes far beyond one kayak. The canopy was a good solution to a real problem. It addressed capsize, which was the obvious threat. It worked by sealing him into the vessel, and the moment the canopy itself was lost or defeated, the system did not degrade gracefully. It went straight from full protection to none. He was suddenly a swimmer, at night, in the open sea, next to a swamped boat, and the one thing that would have kept a swimmer connected to the boat, a physical tether, was not attached. That is the recurring shape of technological failure in this sea. The 1998 harness tether that did not hold, the Wahines tow line that parted, the wooden hull that had survived more than half a century of ocean sailing and could not survive a shelf sea. In every case, the equipment did what it was designed to do until it was outside its design case, and then the fall was not gradual. His kayak and the recovered cockpit canopy are now in the collection of the Australian National Maritime Museum. You can look at them. A 6-meter boat and a fiberglass pod that failed 120 kilometers short of New Zealand. And here's the reversal, delivered by the least equipped vessel in this entire documentary. Nothing in the modern rescue system was faster than the sea. The call went out and was heard. The system did everything correctly. It found the kayak in about a day. The problem was never information. The problem was that between a distress call from a person in the water and the arrival of something that can lift them, the Tasman inserts a delay measured in hours or days, and the human body does not have hours or days. McCauley proved something the 1998 fleet could not, because the fleet was inside helicopter range. He proved that even close to a coastline, in a country with an excellent rescue service, with a signal received and a position known, the distance is still the thing that decides, which makes what happened 10 months later very difficult to explain, until you look closely at the boat. On the 13th of November 2007, 10 months after Andrew McCauley left Fortescue Bay, and 9 months after his kayak was found empty, Two Australians named James Castrician and Justin Jones pushed off from Forster on the mid-north coast of New South Wales and paddled east. 62 days later, on the 13th of January 2008, they landed at Ngamotu Beach near New Plymouth on the North Island of New Zealand, 3,318 kilometers. The first successful, unassisted kayak crossing of the Tasman Sea, west to east. They did it with full knowledge of what had happened to Macaulay. So what was different? Not the ocean, not the weather particularly. 62 days out there guarantees you a spread of everything the Tasman has. Not courage, which is not a variable you can measure, and not one that keeps anybody alive. The difference was the boat and the thinking behind it. Their kayak was called Lot 41, named after the auction lot number of Far Lap. It was a double, 2 cockpits, 2 people. At the stern, it had a cabin. Not a canopy clamped over an open cockpit, but an actual enclosed compartment with modest headroom, long enough for both of them to lie down in. It carried a large water tank and storage for more than 60 days of food. Take those features one at a time, because each one closes a specific failure that killed the previous attempt. 2 people means the boat is never unattended. One paddles while the other sleeps, so the vessel is under control around the clock instead of being sealed up and left to the sea at night. It means that if one person goes into the water, there is another person on the boat. The single most valuable piece of rescue equipment that exists anywhere. A second human being within reach. Macaulay, when he went into the water, had nobody. Nobody could throw him a line. Nobody could stop the boat. Nobody could raise the alarm on his behalf. An enclosed cabin, as opposed to a canopy, changes the failure mode. A canopy is a lid on an open boat. If the lid goes, the protection goes with it, instantly and completely. A cabin is part of the hull. You are inside the vessel rather than under a cover attached to it. A bigger boat carries more, floats higher when swamped, and is far harder for a single breaking crest to overwhelm. And 60 days of food and water means the expedition does not have to hurry. It does not have to push through a weather window it should sit out. It can stop, seal up, and wait. That is the difference, all of it. And it is worth naming clearly because it is the same principle that saved the Southern Cross in 1935, and it will be the principle every single time. In the middle of the Tasman, nobody is coming. So the survivability has to be built into the vessel and the crew before they leave, not called for afterwards. Taylor climbing out on the wing struts with a thermos case was that principle expressed as improvisation. Lot 41 was that principle expressed as design. In both cases, the crew survived because the answer to the emergency was already on board. Castrician and Jones had beacons and satellite communications, and they would have used them if it came to it. They also knew precisely what a beacon gets you in the middle of that sea, an aircraft overhead, some hours later, that can see you and talk to you and cannot pick you up. It is tempting to close that thread with a neat moral about preparation. Resist it. The Tasman does not reliably reward preparation, and plenty of well-prepared people are dead. What the pairing of those 2 crossings actually shows is narrower and harder. In a place where rescue is not physically available, the only variable you control is how long you can stay alive without it. That is not a guarantee. It is the only lever there is. And now watch what happens when you take that same sea and put someone in a situation with the exact opposite problem. Not alone. Not 1,000 kilometers out. 22 people on a brand new ship 225 meters long, with a working engine, a full bridge, a weather forecast in hand, a direct instruction from a port authority, and a rescue helicopter service based in the same city. They were 300 meters from the beach. That was the problem. Newcastle, on the New South Wales coast about 160 kilometers north of Sydney, is one of the biggest coal export ports on Earth. Coal comes down from the Hunter Valley by rail, goes into stockpiles, and gets loaded into bulk carriers that take it to Asia. The loading system has never been able to keep up with the trains, so ships queue. Not in a harbor, there is no room, but at anchor, offshore, in an open roadstead, waiting for a berth. Depending on the year, that queue has run to dozens of vessels sitting in the same patch of water for days or weeks, watching each other, waiting for a phone call. It is a completely normal, entirely commercial arrangement, and it exists because storing empty ships on the ocean is cheaper than building enough loading capacity on shore. Now put that queue on the New South Wales coast in June, which is the middle of East Coast low season. The Pasha Bulker was a brand new ship, built in 2006 by Sasebo Heavy Industries in Japan, 225 meters long, 76,781 tons dead weight. She had been anchored roughly 2 and a bit miles off the coast near Newcastle since the 23rd of May, waiting her turn in a queue of more than 50 ships to load 58,000 tons of coal. She was empty. That single fact is the physical heart of this incident, and it is worth taking slowly because it is not intuitive. A big bulk carrier with no cargo does not sit low and stable in the water. She rides high, enormously high. Meters of red-painted hull that would normally be underwater are exposed to the air. That does 3 things at once, and all of them are bad in a gale. It creates windage. 225 meters of hull side, standing several meters higher out of the water than usual, plus an accommodation block like an apartment building at the stern, is an enormous sail. Wind pushes on it hard and pushes the ship sideways. It lifts the propeller. A ship riding high has less of her propeller immersed, which means the engine's thrust does not fully translate into forward motion. It also lifts the rudder, and a rudder needs water flowing across it to steer, and it reduces the effectiveness of the anchor. An anchor does not hold a ship by weight, it holds by digging into the seabed, and the force that makes it dig is the horizontal pull of the chain lying along the bottom. Raise the ship, increase the wind load, and change the angle of that pull, and the anchor starts to break out. The counter to all of this has been standard practice for as long as there have been big ships. Heavy weather ballast. You flood ballast tanks deliberately to push the ship down into the water. She becomes deeper, less exposed to wind, better propelled, better steered, and better anchored. It costs time and fuel, and it is inconvenient. It is also the difference between a ship that can maneuver in a gale and a ship that cannot. At midday on the 7th of June, after a gale warning was issued, the master of the Pasha Bulker veered more anchor cable, letting out more chain, which is a correct and standard response that improves holding. The weather deteriorated through the evening. Shortly after midnight, the wind reached gale force. By 5 in the morning on the 8th of June, it was blowing a strong gale, and the ATSB's later description of the conditions was simply that the weather was severe. This was not an ordinary gale. The system that arrived that day is now known in Australia as the Pasha Bulker Storm, and the ship it is named after was the least of it. That East Coast low produced flash, flooding across urban Newcastle and down to the Central Coast on the night of the 8th of June, an event of roughly 1 in 100-year severity, affecting some 800,000 people, followed by broader Hunter River flooding 3 days later. 9 people died in that storm. The damage bill came to about 1.6 billion Australian dollars, which put it among Australia's most expensive natural disasters of the last half-century. The Port Corporation radioed the anchored fleet early that morning and told them to get out to sea. That instruction is the whole story in one sentence, and it is the reversal. The safe place for a ship in a storm is the open ocean. Deep water, sea room. Nothing to hit. The dangerous place is close to shore because a shore is a hard object that does not move, and the wind is pushing you onto it. Every mariner knows this. It has a name, a lee shore, and it has been the primary killer of sailing ships for 400 years. When the weather comes, you go out, not in. So the correct action was to sail toward the storm. At 25 past 6 that morning, the Pasha Bulker began to drag her anchor. The master decided to put to sea. That decision is the right one. The question is only whether there was still time and capability to execute it. At 7:45, the anchor was away. Off the bottom, ship free. She had roughly 2 hours left. What follows is the part that people who have never handled a ship find hardest to believe. A 225-meter vessel with a working engine, in deep enough water, being pushed by a strong gale onto a beach, could not get out. Riding high and light, with reduced propeller immersion and reduced rudder effectiveness, with the full side of the ship acting as a sail, the vessel could not generate enough thrust and steering force to drive out through the sea and across the wind faster than the wind was setting her down onto the coast. At 9:51 in the morning, the Pasha Bulker grounded on Nobby's Beach in the middle of Newcastle, in front of the city. There were about 30 meters between her hull and the sand. 22 crew, Filipino and Korean, were aboard a ship lying on a surf beach with a severe gale blowing and heavy seas breaking over her. The rescue that followed was, by the standards of everything else in this documentary, straightforward. The Westpac Rescue Helicopter Service winched them off through the afternoon. By 1:30, all of them were safely ashore. Nobody died on that ship. Say that clearly because it is what makes this incident the most instructive one in the whole sequence. Everything worked. The forecast worked. A gale warning had been issued the previous day, and the Port Authority had passed on a direct instruction to move. The communications worked. The rescue worked quickly and completely because the casualty was 300 meters from a beach in a city with a helicopter service. 22 people went home, and a brand new, fully functional, 76,000-ton ship ended up on a public beach in daylight, in front of thousands of onlookers, and stayed there for over 3 weeks. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau's investigation found that the master had an inadequate understanding of heavy weather ballast, of anchor holding power, and of the limitations of Newcastle's weather-exposed anchorage. Read that finding carefully, because it is not really a finding about one man. Heavy weather ballast, anchor holding, and the exposure of a particular roadstead are not obscure knowledge. They are core seamanship. If a master on a modern ship in a well-regulated port arrives at a gale without that understanding operationally in front of him, the question is, what kind of system produced that situation? A system in which dozens of empty ships sit at anchor off an exposed coast for weeks at a time, in a region with a well-documented winter storm climatology, because the alternative costs money. The salvage took 3 attempts. On the 28th and 29th of June, the tow cables snapped. On the 1st of July, they got her rotated toward deep water and then suspended the operation. On the 2nd of July, at about 20 to 10 at night, she came off. She was later towed away for permanent repairs. New South Wales authorities considered whether negligence could be established and concluded it could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt. No charges were laid. Now put this alongside Andrew Macaulay, because the pairing is the point. Macaulay was 120 kilometers offshore, alone, in a 6-meter boat, and the thing that killed him was distance. The gap between a distress call being heard and a rescuer arriving. The Pasha Bulker was 300 meters offshore, with 22 people aboard, a functioning engine and a warning in hand. And the thing that defeated her was proximity, being close to a shore that the wind could push her onto in a condition that made it impossible to leave. Same sea, same year, 4 months apart. Opposite failure modes. That is what makes the Tasman genuinely difficult to reason about, and it is why the simple mental models people arrive with, it's stormy, it's remote, it's cold, are all incomplete. There is no single safe distance from land here. Out in the middle, nothing can reach you. On the shelf, the sea steepens and breaks. Against the coast, the wind has something to push you onto. The dangerous zone is not a place on the map. It is a relationship between where you are, what you are in, which way the wind is blowing, and how long you have. And that relationship is currently changing. The ocean off southeastern Australia is one of the fastest warming pieces of sea surface on the planet. Near surface waters there are warming at close to 4 times the global average rate, and the warming has been measured down to 750 meters. It is not a surface effect. It goes deep. The reason is the East Australian Current, which has been the quiet mechanism in this entire story. That current is not simply getting warmer. Its southern extension is strengthening and pushing further south, carrying tropical and subtropical water into latitudes that used to be reliably cool and shedding warm eddies into water where they did not previously belong. Researchers using moorings, satellites, and ship surveys have documented eddies penetrating further south as the climate changes, driving ocean warming and what is sometimes called tropicalization of the region. Then, in 2015 and 2016, the Tasman produced the most extreme demonstration of that process yet recorded. A marine heat wave developed off Southeast Australia and lasted 251 days, nearly 9 months. At its peak, it reached 2.9 degrees above the long-term average for that region. An enormous anomaly for open ocean, where temperature is normally the most stable variable there is. The study published in Nature Communications identified the dominant physical cause, an anomalous convergence of heat linked directly to the southward flowing East Australian Current. The attribution work in that paper is worth stating precisely. The authors found that an extreme warming event of that duration was at least 330 times more likely because of anthropogenic climate change, and of that intensity at least 6.8 times more likely. The consequences were biological and immediate. The long-spined sea urchin Centrostephanus rogersi, along with 19 species of fish, extended its range south. Bull kelp died back. Crayweed bleached in places. Farmed shellfish suffered disease outbreaks, and wild mollusks died. That last group is not an abstraction. Those are fisheries and aquaculture businesses on the Tasmanian and New South Wales coasts, which means boats, and boats mean crews, and crews follow the resource. When the fish move south, the fleet moves south with them, into water that is further from port and, in this part of the world, closer to the Southern Ocean weather machine. Now here is where I have to be careful, and where a lot of documentaries would not be. It would be easy and satisfying and wrong to now tell you that climate change is making the Tasman Sea more dangerous. The honest position is more complicated and more interesting. Warmer sea surface temperatures do supply more heat and moisture to the atmosphere, and the Bureau of Meteorology's own explanation of East Coast lows identifies sea surface temperature gradients associated with the warm eddies of the East Australian Current as an important contributor to how those systems develop. More available energy is not nothing. But the research on the storms themselves does not support a simple headline. East Coast lows are highly variable from year to year, and there has been no clear trend in their frequency over the past 50 years. Climate models disagree with each other about whether they will become more or less frequent by the end of the century. Most of the models project no significant change in the intensity of the most severe East Coast low in a given year. What the models do agree on is a different variable: rainfall. Warmer air holds more water, at roughly 7% more per degree of warming, so the intense rainfall associated with these systems is expected to increase. That is a flooding conclusion, not a wave conclusion. So the accurate statement is narrow. The Tasman's heat content is rising, and the warm water engine that feeds these storms is being fed more, and it is pushing further south than it used to. Whether that translates into more frequent or more violent storms at sea is genuinely not settled, and anyone who tells you it is settled is selling you something. What has changed, without any scientific ambiguity at all, is the number of people out there and what they believe they can do. Trans-Tasman air traffic runs continuously. Bass Strait carries daily vehicle ferries between Victoria and Tasmania as a matter of routine, along with the traffic serving the oil and gas infrastructure in the strait itself. The Newcastle coal queue is still a queue. Container ships, log carriers, tankers, and fishing vessels work the whole basin. Recreational offshore sailing has grown enormously, and so has the number of people attempting the crossing under oar, sail, paddle, or their own arrangement of ambition and sponsorship. Every one of those people is operating with better tools than any generation before them. Satellite weather, real-time model output on a tablet, AIS showing every ship within range, chart plotters accurate to a few meters, personal beacons, satellite messengers, and every one of those tools does the same thing to human behavior, which is the last mechanism in this system and the least discussed. Capability expands the accepted risk boundary. That is not a moral failing. It is how people work. A skipper with reliable forecasting will sail in conditions that a skipper without it would have waited out, correctly, because the forecast genuinely reduces the uncertainty. A fishing operator with a stronger boat and better navigation will work aground further offshore in a shorter weather window because the numbers now say it is possible. A solo paddler with a satellite beacon and a modern lifer raft will attempt a crossing that would have been unthinkable without them. A shipping line will keep vessels at anchor off an exposed coast in storm season because modern ships and modern forecasts make that manageable most of the time. In every case, the technology delivered exactly what it promised, and in every case the improvement was converted into more exposure rather than into more margin. That is the trade the Tasman keeps collecting on. It did it to a Dutch navigator who trusted a boat crossing between two ships at anchor. It did it to a shipping route that saved a week by going through a 60-meter strait. It did it to a mail flight demonstrating that the crossing could be flown to a timetable. It did it to a ferry captain who took shelter in a harbor. It did it to a fleet with the best forecasting available in 1998. It did it to a kayaker with a purpose-built survival pod. It did it to a brand new bulk carrier with a warning in hand. None of those people were reckless. Every one of them was doing something that had worked before, in a place where the thing that had worked before was about to stop being sufficient. So here is the answer to the question this started with, assembled from every piece of it. The Tasman does not turn violent faster than other oceans, because it is stormier than other oceans. It turns violent faster because of what its geometry does to energy that has already arrived. Start at the bottom. The sea has a deep basin nobody sails in, and a shallow lip that everybody sails on. In the southwest corner, that lip is 60 meters deep and 250 kilometers wide, sitting directly in the path of swell generated by the Southern Ocean. Any wave with a period long enough to matter is touching the bottom in that strait, which shortens it, steepens it, and turns a passing swell into a breaking wall. Add the current. Warm water runs south along the Australian side at up to about 4 knots and separates into eddies that carry that heat further south than it used to go. When the wind turns southerly, which on that coast it does abruptly in minutes, in a documented pattern that has been logged since the 19th century, the wind is blowing directly against the current. The waves compress and stand up. This happens in deep water, where nothing about the chart warns you. Now add the weather, which the same warm water helps build. Sea surface temperature gradients associated with those warm eddies contribute to the development of east coast lows, and some of those lows deepen explosively. 24 hectopascals in a day, 10 or more in 6 hours. A tropical system that should die coming south can instead transition, expand its wind field, meet a front, and reorganize into something bigger than it ever was in the tropics. None of that is unusual on its own. Shallow seas exist everywhere. Warm boundary currents exist on every western ocean margin. Explosive cyclogenesis happens in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific every winter. What is unusual is the stacking. In the Tasman, all three arrive in the same place, at the same time, on the routes people actually use, and they combine multiplicatively rather than additively. A gale that would be a hard day in deep water becomes survival conditions when it blows against the current, and becomes a boat-breaking sea when that water runs onto a 60-meter shelf. So much for the physical system. The human system sits on top of it and is just as consistent. Everyone who dies out there is there for a reason that has not changed in 400 years. A trading company wanted to know if the southern land was worth anything. A shortcut through the strait saved a week. Emigrant ships had a season to keep. A mail contract had to be won on a specific date. A ferry ran overnight to a timetable people planned their lives around. A small freighter took the west coast because it was 4.5 hours quicker. A race starts on Boxing Day because it has always started on Boxing Day. 50 ships wait at anchor off a beach because a coal terminal cannot load them any faster, and waiting on the water is cheaper than building more capacity. Every one of those is a schedule. And every schedule is a commitment made in advance about a piece of ocean whose behavior is decided later. Then, technology enters, and it does something that looks like safety and functions as exposure. The lighthouses genuinely reduced wrecks, and they told a navigator where he was without telling him what was coming. Steam removed the need for a fair wind and created the timetable. Radio meant a ship in distress could be heard and changed nothing about how long help took to arrive. Engines let vessels leave shelter and go further out. Forecasting identified the storm and could not manufacture the hours a fleet needed to escape it. Beacons made position instantaneous and left the closing speed exactly where it was in 1935. Stronger hulls, better navigation, satellite weather, and real-time modeling all did what they promised. And every one of them moved the line at which a competent professional is expected to say yes. There is the mechanism, not stupidity, not arrogance. A slow, rational, industry-wide conversion of improved capability into increased exposure, repeated across 2 centuries, in a sea that punishes exposure faster than almost anywhere, with cities on it. And then, distance decides the rest. It is the only variable in this entire system that has barely moved. 2 national rescue organizations divide this water between them, and between them they are responsible for more than 80 million square kilometers of ocean. Their alerting capability is close to perfect. Their reach is not. A helicopter can pull 55 people out of Bass Strait in a day and a night because Bass Strait is inside its radius. 120 kilometers off Milford Sound, an aircraft can find you in a day and cannot lift you. In the middle, 1,000 kilometers from anywhere, the honest answer is that the only rescue equipment that matters is what you brought. The question that always gets asked after these events is whether they were preventable, and the 1998 race is still argued about, in public, by the people who were there. The coroner's conclusions about race management and about the communication of the forecast were sharp, and they are contested to this day by sailors who lived through it. That argument will not be settled, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What can be said is narrower and, I think, more useful. Nothing that came out of that inquest, and nothing that has been added to the rules since, changes the seabed, the current, the rate at which a low can deepen, or the number of hours between a boat in the middle of Bass Strait and a harbor it can safely reach. The reforms made people easier to find. They did not make the trap shallower. The people in this story are not, on the whole, a cautionary tale. A Dutch navigator who left a hostile bay immediately. A ferry captain whose evacuation timing and inquiry judged to be close to the only survivable choice available. Sailors on a 50-year-old wooden yacht who got a distress call out and got everyone into rafts before she went. 7 men who survived 9 days in an inflatable, and then a beach they could not climb out of. Air crews who winched into 70 knots repeatedly through a night and went back the next morning. 22 seafarers who were lifted off a grounded ship without a single injury. Most of them did the job properly. The environment simply ran a clock they could not beat. Which is why nothing about this stops. Every Boxing Day, a little after midday, the fleet comes out through Sydney Heads on a northeasterly, spinnakers up, the sandstone cliffs on both sides packed with people, ferries and spectator boats stacked across the water behind them. The whole thing looks like a holiday, and for most of its history, it has been one. 300 kilometers south of that start line, the seabed comes up to 60 meters. Off to the west, the warm current is running south at a couple of meters a second, feeding heat into air that is about to meet something colder. Somewhere on the coast, a rescue crew is reading the same forecast the fleet just read and checking fuel figures against distances. The boats turn south past the cliffs, the way they have almost every year since 1945. They always do. That is the part of the system nobody has ever managed to change.